Hi guys, it's that time again. Every week so far since the beginning of March, we have held a Skeptics in the Hub. But tonight is different because we have a co-host. We are sharing this live stream with Atheist Alliance International in the form of Michael Sherwood, who is the new chief executive. And I'm not sure, he's a long way away. He's in Tasmania, so I might only get his audio. Let me try, see what I can get from him. No, he's not got his mic and camera phone. Not connected yet. I'll send him a message. Meanwhile, let me give you some messages too, because we have some rules or some guidance that might help with this event, because I know a lot of you like to comment and question and join in, and some of you like to come on screen if you've got the right equipment yourselves. All you need is a laptop, basically, with a camera and a microphone, not muted. And if you can do that and you want to ask questions, I can put your questions on screen, but you'll be commenting amongst yourselves as well, probably. So please distinguish for me between your ordinary comments and your questions, like this. Put a Q in front of your statement to make me aware that it is a question. So while Michael Sherlock gets himself sorted down in Tasmania, he's got a problem with his browser. Change to Chrome. Honestly, the technology is wonderful when it works, isn't it? So I have another guest, of course, because as you know, this week's event is topical. It's Easter time, so it's on the resurrection. And we have old friend Jonathan MS Pearce to come and give us a presentation on that. Here he is. Hello, John.
Hello. Hello, I'm here.
Good. How the devil are you? It's good to have one successful connection.
I am well in the land of heathens, and I'm looking forward to giving a bit of critical analysis of the resurrection account, certainly the history or the historicity of the resurrection account as believed by Christians. Excellent.
Now, as it should happen, I did a debate on this back in November. I was summoned by the Christian Union of St. Andrews University, and my opponent was one Dr. Andy Bannister, and the topic was actually worded as, did Jesus rise from the dead? Which, you know, another way of saying the same thing. And so if you're interested, you can see the video of this debate either on Atheist Alliance International's channel or on my personal Patreon channel, which is called John Richards Anti-Theist. So I come up right at the top of that list. And it was an interesting debate. I started out actually by saying, before really that you can presume that Jesus rose from the dead, you have to actually demonstrate that he really existed. That was my starting point.
Yeah, I suppose the point is rather moot if you just flat out don't believe in God, in which case it's like doing a resurrection of, I don't know, another god in ancient times. We were like, well, I don't believe in those gods. So, but this is obviously prevalent because so many of the world, or so many of our world, are Christian, and so therefore it has that special place in particularly our sort of westernized lives, if you like.
Yeah, 2 billion adherents to the Christian faith, if you believe the statistics.
Yeah, you get an awful lot of people who don't really understand their belief, and you know, it's like, what is the no true Scotsman fallacy? What is a true Christian? And you know, okay, if anyone who claims they are is a Christian, then that's fine. But one of the things I'll start off with very quickly saying in my talk is that people don't even understand what the Son of God means, right? So they actually think that Jesus is just some kind of, you know, family member of the God family, without realizing that Jesus was God incarnate, and so that kind of thing exists throughout Christendom. So you get an awful lot of people who say they're Christians but don't really understand what they believe, I would say. And
very few of them have actually read the Bible. They've just listened to their pastor or priest's cherry-picked quotes.
Yeah, and there's certainly truth to that. Yeah. I mean, the only caveat I will say is that, as you know, I was diagnosed with MS in the fairly recent past, and so my brain isn't quite as sharp as it used to be. And so if I have quite a wordy PowerPoint to go with this, which is more for me than for you guys. So it's just because my brain isn't, you know, I'm okay if I'm focused and narrow. So hopefully I'll be able to get through this.
I'm going to hand that over to you now, John. So that.
Fantastic.
I'm going to go into the control room, leave you to it, and that way, hopefully, I can sort out Michael, who's having another go at connecting. I see.
Fantastic. Well, if you whack up my PowerPoint, we can get this bad boy started.
Over to you.
Brilliant. So, welcome to the world of internet lockdowns or corona, of online internet chats and discussions. We're going to talk about the resurrection. Now, I've just, you know, here's a bunch of books I've written, whoop-de-doo. I blog at Atypical Philosopher on the Pathos Network, so please join me there for some good discussions. So I want to start with looking at what is entailed in the resurrection and why it's so important. And the best place to start here is with Paul, who was the earliest writer in the New Testament. And he says this, and this shows that the resurrection is the cornerstone of Christian belief. So now, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how does some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, Christ has been raised, which means in your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we witnessed against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised, and if Christ has not been raised, our faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. And that is in 1 Corinthians. It's a very famous passage, of course. Now, basically what that says is, if you don't believe in the resurrection, then Christian preaching is empty, and so is anyone's faith, because the object of the faith of Christ is not whom he said he was, and so on and so on and so on. All these ideas sort of fall by the wayside. Hugely important ideas for Christian belief if you do not believe in the resurrection. And Paul was very aware of this, and he was the one who sort of created the whole of Christianity in the first place, arguably. So I suppose the opening question is, if you wanted to achieve all of these things as a God, then is the resurrection as accounted or recounted in the Bible, is that the best way of doing it? I'd argue that really isn't. So what am I going to say in this talk? I am going to have to rattle through my talk, because I have about 2 hours worth of stuff that I'm going to pack into 45 minutes for the first two parts, and in the Q&A we'll go through hopefully some naturalistic explanations of the data. So I'll look at the claims of the resurrection, and that they are incredible claims that require really good quality evidence. I'm then going to look at the fact that the Gospels are not reliable sources of information, and they are in fact poor quality evidence. And then we'll go on to naturalistic ideas of what might have happened, and whether those are more probable than the recounts given in the Gospels. So actually, what did happen? Just to remind you, we'll start with Jesus was God in human form. And I just talked about this, and this happens from school onwards. People have poorly taught Christian theology, so that you keep hearing God the Father, God the Son, and not realizing that this isn't a biological nomenclature. This is basically a way, the Son of Man or Son of God is a way of saying that Jesus was super important. Really, is the layman's understanding. What Jesus was, God in human form. God the Father is in some way the same but different than God in human form as Jesus, but it is God. So when Jesus is crucified, God is crucified, and when Jesus is resurrected, God is resurrected. Now, what happened? Well, Jesus went to Jerusalem, had the Last Supper with his disciples before going out to the Garden of Gethsemane and praying to himself. He was arrested for the blasphemy of claiming to be divine, and this was a high crime. He went on trial, he was sentenced to death, he was crucified and died. There was an earthquake. Tombs were opened and dead saints paraded around Jerusalem and appeared to many people, and the veil in the temple was torn, rent in twain, and there was darkness for 3 hours. So some really big ramifications of what happened, physical events that happened in and around Jerusalem, and arguably the whole world. Depends about the darkness, we don't know. The suffering of Jesus contributed to a greater good and atoned somehow for all of humanity's sin that God needed for some reason to balance books, or some other theory that Christians themselves can't quite agree on. And this is the atonement. I'm not going to talk about the atonement. The atonement is why the resurrection happened theologically. What was necessary? Why was it necessary for Jesus to be crucified, to die, and to resurrect and ascend into heaven? Theologically, what does that mean? And basically the most prevalent theory these days is Mysterianism, which is to say it's a mystery. Somehow it works. We don't really know how, we don't know why, but it atones for sins in some manner. Mysterianism is a mystery. I don't buy that. That's skeptical theism, and it's pretty weak. But there you go. I'm not going to talk about the atonement because you can have a whole set of lectures on that alone. Jesus is then taken and buried by a Sanhedrin member. That's a Jewish council member, Joseph of Arimathea. Guards are placed on the tomb. We only see this in Matthew. And then 3 days later, depending on which gospel you read, a bit like Bart Ehrman, he likes to say that in his debates and lectures. It does depend which gospel you read from now on, for sure. Actually, and for the events that happened on the previous slide, Jesus rose again with perhaps this chronology, and we'll forget the contradictions of which there are many. Some people, how many I don't know exactly, and who they were, go to the tomb. 0, 1, or 2 angels are there, and the stone is rolled away. Jesus is resurrected and goes around appearing to lots of people in the local area and in Galilee in over a 40-day period, including 500 people. Jesus then ascends into heaven by rising up into the clouds. Angels tell the disciples to stop staring, and the Holy Spirit turns up and gives them some pretty cool skills, like being able to talk in tongues. So that's basically what happens, as according to differing degrees, Paul and then the 4 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And I'm going to start with talking about this idea that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And you hear this a lot with Christian thinkers particularly. Apologists will say, well, just because there is no evidence for it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Really common defense. My first thing to say to that is bollocks. And what I mean by this is it's simply not true. Let me explain. So I live near Portsmouth. If I was to say to you that yesterday a massive earthquake hit Portsmouth and the ground was rent in 2, and in fact maybe lava poured out of the crack and the whole city shook, and I tell you this, and then you go and look for evidence of this, you ask hundreds of other people, you look in the newspapers, so on and so forth, and you find absolutely no evidence to support my claim. does this strengthen or weaken my case, or do nothing at all to my case? The fact that no other human being can verify my claims. So what happens here is, if you expect evidence to be heard, if you expect to see other evidence and you don't see that other evidence or hear about it, then this is actually damaging for the case in hand. Let's take the Portsmouth earthquake and now look at the earthquake that supposedly happens in Matthew around the time of Jesus' death. There's an earthquake, tombs are opened, the dead spirits, these are zombies effectively, parading around Jerusalem and appearing to many. And the veil of the temple is torn. That's a very famous part of the temple is torn, and there's darkness around for 3 hours. Now, imagine I told you all of those things happened yesterday in Portsmouth, and you couldn't find a single bit of evidence outside of me telling you I am the Gospels now. Outside of me, the Gospels, you can't find any evidence of that happening. What does this do to my claim of this happening? This is the most amazing claim ever. This is, well, the second most amazing claim ever. The other claim being that God, man, has died and raised, resurrected and raised into heaven. So we should expect this evidence to support these claims, but they are not there. And this absence of evidence is a disconfirmation by silence. It disconfirms the claim that these things happen, the fact that no other evidence exists when we should definitely expect it. And this adds to the probability that the claims are false. So I just want to put that out there first of all. So how do we know about the claims of the resurrection? Well, we hear from Paul, first of all. He wrote first, I don't know, maybe some 20, 30 years after Jesus died. He's the earliest source on Jesus. He says nothing about the empty tomb, the burial, or the resurrection, apart from a general, that quote I read to you earlier is a general talk about the resurrection. But the details are absolutely absent. Now, we should expect these details because actually they would be a really persuasive mechanism for Paul to be talking to people he is trying to convert to in his letters to the early churches and whatnot. The details are conspicuous in their absence, and they would have been useful for him. So it's really odd that as the earliest person who potentially has access to these supposed eyewitnesses mentions nothing of it. This lends itself, I think, to the notion that it's a later development. The empty tomb thesis is a later development added on to the resurrection story. Then we have Gospels written after Jesus died, maybe 50 to 70 years after he died, maybe a bit before, maybe a bit after, and maybe a lot after. Now, you have to remember that the Gospels were non-eyewitness accounts. People like Luke say this at the beginning. You know, these are not eyewitness accounts. We don't know the provenance, where they're from. We don't know when they were written. We can have a guess. They're written ex post facto. So that means that these guys believed that Jesus was the Messiah, particularly John believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and then wrote histories about Jesus. They are therefore very agenda driven. They're biased. They are unverified by any other accounts, and they are unverifiable. I mean, who do you go and speak to? Because there are no particular people who are mentioned other than maybe Pilate. Well, who goes and speaks to Pilate to verify these claims? They're codependent. They depend on each other, as that little sort of picture might show you. They're written in Greek and not in Aramaic. They have unknown sources. So these are the sources that we have to ask the resurrection story. Mark, the earliest gospel, doesn't even feature the resurrection account. It's a later interpolation called all scholars. So the resurrection story in Mark, the earliest gospel, is added later, not by Mark. So what does that tell you? It tells you that these look to be later developments. And also a lot of private conversations are written, and this applies to all of the Gospels throughout, from the beginning of the Gospels to the end. It also applies to the Old Testament. All those conversations in there. Who has a dictaphone? Who is recording these conversations? It's seemingly a minor point, but actually I think it's hugely important for really questioning skeptically the historicity of biblical accounts. So how do we know things in general? Well, there is a theory, it's a mathematical theory called Bayes' theorem. Now we can use this, or some people are a bit testy about using it. Richard Carrier is a big fan of Bayes' theorem and says that it should be applied by historians, and in fact is applied by them, but they just don't realize they're doing it, and that we use it every day. And it involves, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it involves background knowledge, the evidence you're going to bring to the table, and comparing the likelihood of different theories as to see what is the most likely theory relatively to account for the data. So an example of this might be that yesterday in Portsmouth, I saw a bush move, right? Some leaves sort of fluttered and moved. Right. I claim it was a tiger that moved those leaves. We have two theses. Move the leaves, or now, just without any evidence to the table, just on what's called our background knowledge, our prior probability, knowing what we do about Portsmouth, that tigers don't live in Portsmouth, it's highly improbable that that was a tiger that moved the bush. And it's highly probable that it was in fact the wind. So the prior probability would say the wind is what did it, and it's highly unlikely it was a tiger. But if I then bring some evidence to bear, for example, a circus was in town last night, and we know that a tiger escaped, and I saw a flash of orange and what looked like a large beast behind the bush. Now we're bringing some evidence of where it was 99.9999% probable that it was the wind. Now it's, oh, so we have a competing theory in the tiger, and it possibly maybe 50% tiger. I don't know. Maybe we could have arguments for and against the tiger, but actually, given the extra data and evidence that I'm bringing to the table, those relative probabilities have changed. And that's basically what we do when we're crossing the road without looking. Is that stupid? Well, let's think about the probability of traffic and what we know about roads and blah, 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 blah. We do this all the time. But this is a very mathematical and supposedly objective way of looking at the competing theories. What this boils down to for me, I don't want to get too mathematical and too geeky about it, but what it really boils down to is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In the world of epistemology, how do we know things? The study of knowledge. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And again, you often hear theists, Christians say, well, actually, this isn't true. I think William Lane Craig has famously denied this, but it is obviously true. And I am going to explain why this is true. Claim one, I have a dog. Background knowledge, I live in Britain. People have dogs pretty commonly. You have no reason to think I'm lying. Therefore, I've probably got a dog. What evidence do you need to support that so that you believe this claim? Probably nothing more than my verbal testimony is needed. I've got a dog. Fair enough, mate. You've got a dog. Happy days. Now I make a claim. I've got a dog. It's in the bath. Yeah, okay, I can believe that. I mean, it's a bit weirder. Maybe I'll believe that with one eyebrow raised. Okay, I've got a dog in a bath and it's wearing a dress. That's starting to get a bit odd. I probably need a photo of this just to believe you, because, you know, I don't really believe you put a dog in a bath with a dress. Maybe I can believe you if I know you well and you seem like you're being honest, and maybe. But if I don't know you well, I'll probably need a photo. I've got a dress-wearing dog in a bath with a skunk wearing a scuba outfit. Okay. I would need probably, I don't know, I need some video evidence of this because that sounds proper weird. I have all the above in the bath, but the bath water is boiling and the animals are happy. Who knew? Okay, I would need video and independent attestation that the video was not doctored, agreeing that this is what happened, what appeared to be happening, because actually this does seem to defy our known understanding of how the world works. Boiling water, animals happy. That's really odd. I'd need to see videos of that for sure. Okay, all of the above. The dog has a fire-breathing dragon on its shoulder and the skunk is dancing with a live unicorn. Okay, now this is a really extraordinary claim. Well, I'll be damned. I need video of video. I need independent and multiple attestation from recognizably reliable sources, technological experts, biological experts, psychological experts, evaluating me as a claimant, and so on. What this says is with each step along this ladder of steps, the claim becomes more extraordinary. And with each further level of extraordinariness, we need more and more evidence, and that work. That's just how we work, unless you want to be really, really double. So the resurrection, we've got a human form, 5 and 3 days. Later, he resurrects again to life. There's an earthquake. Tombs are open, dead saints parading around Jerusalem, appearing to many people, and the veil in the temple is torn. There's darkness for 3 days. He hangs around for some time. He's seen by others, carrying out some miracles, and this is all recounted in a few Gospels. So, how does this fare with Bayes' theorem? Given that we're not going to think about evidence now, what's a prior probability? Well, even the Christian will look at all previous accounts of resurrected deities or humans, or any claims of resurrection, and they will say, I don't believe them. They deny all the previous claims of resurrection, which is to say that any new claim of resurrection is highly likely to be false as well, because literally the previous 10, 50, 100, 200 have been false. So the prior probability of this resurrection claim is very, very low indeed, because Christians and atheists agree that all the other claims are false. Atheists would just say this one's false as well. So in order to overcome this very low prior probability, this extraordinarily improbable claim, you have to have absolutely superb evidence. Can the quality of the evidence overcome these low priors? That's the question. The evidence quality should be incredibly high. Unfortunately, the evidence quality is incredibly low. So we have very low priors. Without looking at the evidence, this is incredibly unlikely to have happened. Then looking at the evidence is basically not very good at all, which means that really I don't have much justification for believing these resurrection claims. Now, are these really the best sources? As I've already said all of this. So these writers in the Gospels already believed Jesus was the Messiah, John more so than the others. They were not eyewitnesses. They were trying to evangelize, had their agendas, were not writing objective history, but were writing agenda-driven persuasive pieces 50 to 100 years after the death of the person they're writing about, with an unknown geography and time. There is no recognizable historical methodology that we can see in other writers at the same time. They had unknown sources. They were dependent on each other. They were written in Greek and not Aramaic, Jesus' own tongue. They recounted private conversations. How do we know them? And they disagree and have contradictions. So straight away, we are in trouble as a Christian in believing these. Let me analogize with David Koresh. Now, imagine I really dig David Koresh. Check out the hair, check out the glasses. I think this man is awesome. I think he's so awesome. I think he is the Messiah. Now, at this moment in time right now, believe, well, actually, technically, we're going to analogize correctly, probably another 10 or 20 years' time. I believe this to be accurate. I believe the claims that he is a Messiah to be accurate. And I, whilst in another country, this is all analogizing to the Gospels, who wrote their, most of the Gospels appear to be written elsewhere. So whilst in another country, some 20 years plus after David Koresh died, actually 30, 40, 50 years plus, I believe he's a living Messiah, but I have no telephone and internet, and I have no car or public transport to research this, right? And even this, converted, I claim that this guy is a Messiah. I fully believe he's a Messiah. And then I write a history of this guy's life and make claims about what happened in his life. I've never met him, and there's no way of knowing, and given where I live, it's unlikely that I would ever have met his disciples, but you can't verify this. I call myself an evangelist, one whose job it is to convince other people using persuasive techniques that Koresh is the Messiah. The question is, would you think my account of David Koresh as a messianic believer, a follower of him, written in that same context that I've just described, would my account be a reliable account of David Koresh's life? I'll leave you with that. So when we look at the Gospels, now already we know that Paul, the earliest writer, doesn't think any details about the empty tomb. So when we get onto these claims of Jesus resurrecting, we have the four Gospels. And remember, Mark arguably doesn't really count because it's an interpolation. Well, how many women went to the tomb? It depends which Gospel you read. When did they go to the tomb? What did the woman see? What was said? Did Jesus appear to the woman? Which disciples went to the tomb? Did the disciples believe the reports of the woman? How many disciples did Jesus appear to first? Where were the disciples told to go? And where did Jesus ascend into heaven? All of these questions are met with contradictory answers by the four Gospels, and actually if you include Corinthians and Acts written by, well, Acts written by the author of Luke and Corinthians by Paul, then you have even more contradictory sources. So we have big old contradictions here. The flat out disagreements. Only Matthew, as well as disagreements, just absences as well. Only Matthew mentions the earthquakes, the angel causing the sun to roll, dead saints parading, the old zombie apocalypse as is, guards at the tomb. The last words of Jesus, disagreement. Who buried him? How many women? Who came to the tomb? Who else did women see at the tomb? One or two. Was the tomb already open? Yes or no? Did the women tell the disciples? Did they tell no one? Or did they immediately tell people? Who saw Jesus resurrected? Paul says 500 people saw him, but this doesn't appear in the Gospels. Did Mary Magdalene cry, or was she filled with joy? Did she recognize Jesus? Yes or no? Where did Jesus tell the disciples to meet him, in Galilee or Jerusalem? So the contradictions are so wide and varied, and these aren't just little details. So people like N.T. Wright, who's a biblical scholar, will say, well, it's just like having four different newspaper accounts and they've just got different angles on the story. But if I was reporting on a burning house, right, and another journalist was, and one of us reports that there was an angel dancing on top of the house that was definitely there. And if I agree that angel was there, but I don't include it in my account of the burning house, I don't understand how I could not include that. I don't understand the whole idea that you've got four journalists going at these things from four different directions does not apply effectively to this example, to the case of the resurrection. The differences are so myriad that that I don't think that you can do this. Yes, you might argue, well, oh, was it one or two people there are less important? But, you know, when we talk about angels, when we talk about earthquakes, when we talk about a parade of saints around Jerusalem that appeared to many people, the fact that that's not talked about is incredibly weird. So let's think of another analogy, this modern day analogy. Now, there's Satya Sai Baba. Now, some of those resurrection claims should be verifiable. It would be nice if they were. But we have Satya Sai Baba in India, who in contemporary times has done far more miracles, attested to by supposedly video cameras and far more technology, certainly. And he has a greater number of followers than Jesus ever did at a comparable time. And yet, given that he's done all these amazing miracles, supposedly, Christians and atheists alike absolutely disbelieve those miracle claims. But actually, they have a better provenance than the miracle claims surrounding Jesus' resurrection. So, in fact, the Christian has less epistemic warrant, less justification to believe the Jesus claims than he does Satya Sai Baba. And yet, happy, I mean, there's tremendous double standards here. Happy to disregard the miracle claims of Satya Sai Baba, for example. And you could apply this kind of comparison to many other miracle workers in the world over the last 2,000 years. I think there is a great set of double standards being employed. Let's look a little bit at Joseph of Arimathea. He appears, I don't think in Mark, but appears in each successive gospel in a more and more embellished form. So what's interesting to begin with is that there is no such place as Arimathea on record. Now, we know that the temple in Jerusalem burnt down in 72 CE. So, and the Gospels were written after that, almost certainly. And so, therefore, it's very convenient that there are no records. The writers can just say, oh, there was this Sanhedrin member called Joseph of Arimathea, and he took Jesus' body down from the cross and buried him in his tomb. Richard Carey did a really good lexicographical analysis of Arimathea, the Greek, and he concludes that it actually means best disciple. And this is really important because there is this reversal of expectations motif that appears loads in the Gospels, and that means that you expect the disciples to be really awesome, but they end up bungling an awful lot of stuff and not believing. And you have this where you would normally expect the disciples to be the good guys who do the things right by Jesus. They end up not believing him, and so on and so forth. So I won't spend an awful lot of time on this, but the idea that Joseph of Arimathea is arguably called Joseph of best disciple, and he's the one that ends up doing these things and not the disciples, doing these things being taking his body down and burying it honorably, is very suspect. Dennis MacDonald writes that actually a lot of the stories in the Gospels are because the Gospel writers, some of them were very proficient in Greek. So this one, Joseph of Arimathea, seems to be a rewriting of Homer's Iliad, where Joseph of Arimathea is the pream. They increase in embellishments with each gospel. The character of Joseph of Arimathea, and in non-canonical gospels, the ones that aren't included in the New Testament, even more so. Now, we know the Sanhedrin, sure, but we can be pretty certain, I think, that the Sanhedrin wouldn't allow Joseph of Arimathea his request. After all, Jesus has been crucified in a very dishonorable way for high treason, for sedition. Right? There is no way that Pilate and the Sanhedrin would get this guy crucified and then go, oh yeah, you can bury him honorably. That's fine. We want a dishonorable death, but an honorable burial. Absolutely not. What happened to Joseph of Arimathea? Well, he disappears. He's never heard from again. He would be prime early church leader material and a really useful person to be pulling on for early church stuff. So it's quite bizarre that he suddenly disappears. The whole account is not verifiable. The sacking of Jerusalem means the records are destroyed, so we can't verify anything about Joseph of Arimathea because there's no such place that we can find, and there's no record of this person ever existing. But he randomly had an empty tomb at hand and was able to put someone in it, which allows for the whole resurrection account to take place and allows for this kind of honorable burial. But this is a bit odd because actually in Acts, there's a contradiction here, which says, and when they had fulfilled all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and placed him in a tomb. Now, this doesn't look like Joseph of Arimathea. This looks like a random they, whoever they are. So Acts maybe doesn't quite agree here. And very suspiciously, we have a fulfillment of Isaiah. It looks very much like to me that the resurrection accounts are a case of Jesus dying on the cross, being buried and being resurrected, but something going on anyway, that the disciples can't quite understand why their Messiah, who ordinarily would be a sort of militaristic, awesome Jew who goes on to fulfill, you know, the fulfillment of what a Messiah generally is thought to be, he ends up dying. So they have a bit of cognitive dissonance. Their brains can't quite work out how this happens. So they go back through the Old Testament and look for prophecies that kind of suggest this might happen in a kind of post hoc rationalization. Well, if you look at Isaiah, his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he has with a rich man in his death. Now, this rich man, of course, is Joseph of Arimathea. So I would argue this looks like the authors have gone back into the Old Testament and found little nuggets that they can nick. And they did this in Luke and Matthew did this, particularly Matthew, in the nativity accounts. I wrote a book called Nativity Critical Examination, which basically does the same sort of analysis with the nativity accounts, and they're equally as problematic, arguably more so actually. And Matthew particularly went through the Old Testament and looked to be just pilfering different sort of prophecies or half prophecies or just quotes he could get to then justify certain claims of his nativity account. And this looks like what's going on here for Joseph Arimathea. Another example of this kind of digging in the Old Testament looks to be Psalm 22. Now, if any of you have seen the Passion of Christ, you know Jesus getting scourged, you know, whipped on the man was a state. I don't know the historicity of the Passion of Christ, of course. Mel Gibson is not the greatest biblical scholar I know, but Jesus had been whipped. His clothes would have been in it. And yet they cast lots for them. The soldiers cast lots for his blood-soaked, ripped clothing. What's going on there? Then you look at Psalm 22. For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them. And for my clothing, they cast lots. Okay, now I understand. So this is, by adding this in, you are giving it Old Testament pedigree, which is to say that Jesus is fulfilling the prophecies and every jot and tittle of the law. So this is really important for the gospel writers to give Jesus that stamp of Old Testament authority. And so you get this a lot where you've got odd additions, odd things happening in some of these accounts, and going, well, why would they do that? Oh, I see, because it helps to join it up with the Old Testament. Right, okay, I get that. And of course, for me, that devalues the historicity of the accounts. So now we have Jesus dying, and this is where there are loads of problems with the historical accounts of Jesus dying and being resurrected. And this is the key for me of why it's not believable. The historicity is hugely problematic. Jesus was condemned to death, and he was hated by the Jewish council and by the Romans and executed for the highest known crime. And he had no family in the city, no one willing to support him or provide a burial place for him that we know of. So what's our background knowledge? Go back to Bayes' theorem. What's a probability of the claims, the Christian thesis being true here? Well, actually, of him being allowed to be given an honourable burial, very low, unless we've got really good evidence. And all these sort of claims that have a very low prior probability unless we bring a shed load of evidence to bear. And the evidence just isn't there, or the quality of the evidence just isn't there. We have no known precedent for the highest form of crime and criminal being given anything like honour in their death. Okay, the whole notion of crucifixion is to be dishonourable. It's punishment beyond death. So what would happen is someone would be hung up for days to be pecked at by wild beasts and to act as a deterrent. If you've got the highest criminal, you would want that to happen even more so. And yet the idea is that he's just taken down straight away and put in a lovely cozy tomb. La-di-da, isn't that nice? No, Jesus would have been left out there and then put in a shallow grave. Any other account of those details would need some tremendous evidence and some really good reasons to support it, and the reasons given are not good enough. So that dishonor is really important for the Sanhedrin and for the Romans. And at the end of the day, Pilate is a famously mean-spirited man. He would not go, "Oh yeah, I've just done that for you. I didn't let him survive. He was crucified, but yeah, you can go and treat him well. That's fine, no problem." So again, we have other problems with his death. Arguably should have been stoned is the more appropriate punishment for his crime. There's only one case of someone being taken off the cross that we definitely know, and that was for an emperor, right? Criminals were generally put in shallow graves. And the digester that was written a couple of hundred years later said an exception could be given for simple crimes, and the body would be given to the family, but explicitly not for treason. And this was for treason. I mean, the digester says this can't happen. And yet the Christians claim it happened, or the Gospels claim it happened. And the body was not given to kinfolk, but to Joseph of Arimathea, who was your best disciple, who disappeared and came from a place that there's no history of, so on and so forth, as I have already said. Now, the belief that you couldn't bury criminals near the righteous meant that he would have been put in a shallow grave, not in an empty tomb. And this is an interesting little one. Round stones were not used in tombs until after 70 CE. Now, the idea is that the gospel writers were writing after 70 CE, and they would be looking around and going, well, that's what a tomb looks like, to a round stone. So there's a round stone. It was rolled away by angels. Angels sat on top of them, blah, 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 blah. Round stones, round stones. It turns out that actually, when the archaeological evidence at the time of Jesus' death, they would have been rectangular stones. So again, we have a little nugget of verifiability, archaeological verifiability, and it fails. And again, I did this with the nativity, is that every time you have a cross section with a verifiable historical account that could verify the nativity account's historicity, they fail. Every time you have a cross section, they fail. And it looks like it here as well. This is another important one that often gets forgotten. The tomb was not venerated. So the idea, you can't see it on the slide, unfortunately, the early Christians did not know where the tomb was. Right, you've got your God rising and dying, being buried, rising, going into heaven, right? To think that that place wouldn't be venerated if you knew where it was, if you had this story where you had women going to the tomb, you had disciples going to the tomb. This is an incredible sight. That's where Jesus, that's where God was buried in human form, and that's where God resurrected. If you don't think that place would be venerated, when we know that Jewish people did venerate, and basically every culture ever has venerated. If you don't think that place would have been a shrine, I'm sorry, you're not thinking straight. That the tomb is not venerated means that the resurrection accounts are not as they are claimed to be. and that in fact they're likely absolutely much later developments and mythologies invented over the fact that Jesus most likely died and was buried in a shallow grave. End of. And maybe had his body moved and there was a mistake, whatever, cognitive dissonance, whatever. We'll go into that later. But the idea is that Christians didn't know where he was buried because his tomb was not venerated. Oh, that's the rest of it. Did not know where it was. So there was no precedent for any of this stuff. And so that means that our prior probabilities should be very low. And yet the Christian will believe this. Is the evidence good enough to overcome the prior probabilities? Absolutely not. The Gospels are massively contradictory and they're very low quality evidence. Another little nugget is Matthew and the guards of the tomb. So Matthew is the only Gospel writer who includes guards of the tomb. And the story goes like this in Matthew. The chief priests were worried that the disciples could steal the body and fake a resurrection. Pretty good second guess in there. So they went to Pilate and got permission to post guards. Jesus rose. The guards witnessed Jesus rise and they lay prostrate and it's all amazing. But rather than believe Jesus, even given their reaction, they return back to the priests, tell them that he's resurrected, and then the priests bribe them to claim that the disciples stole the body while the guards slept. And Matthew then claims to this day that the Jews report the body is stolen. So what Matthew's doing here is he's second guessing, or he's actually seeing around him the reactions to maybe earlier writing or stories that Jesus resurrected. Jews would have been going, no, he didn't resurrect. His body was stolen. It was just missing from the tomb. So he then puts in this little mechanism to cut off any of these sort of refutations from Jews. But there are loads of problems with this thesis. The idea that the priests would have been thinking that Jesus would resurrect means that they would have to have an understanding of the theology involved, which is only developed later, 100 years later, 50 years later, whatever. The idea that they could second guess that this itinerant preacher his disciples would claim that he resurrected is just extraordinarily foresightful of them and highly unlikely. The priests demand that the guards go there a full night after he's already been put in there. So, I mean, it's a weird story anyway. Doesn't feature in any of the other Gospels. And who are the sources for this account? So the only people it can be are the guards, right? But the guards then go on and don't appear to believe that Jesus is God, even though they've seen him resurrect. Oh, it's just so weird. And these kind of Jewish allegations, you know, also mentioned later in Justin's dialogue with the sort of invented Jew Trypho. So he sort of produces these arguments and then argues against them, Justin, among the early church thinkers. So you have this bizarre addition to Matthew only, which just doesn't stand up to any kind of evaluation. So really, that's where we're at the moment. And I could end the talk here, but I'm doing okay for time. So I'll just quickly go on to naturalistic theories before the Q&A, because I can rattle through the naturalistic theories. Now, and if you want to look at the problems with the resurrection, I mean, I'd suggest, you know, The Empty Tomb is a fantastic book. I mean, look at the size of this bad boy on the resurrection. Another really good book. Chris Komanitsky's book is excellent as well. I mean, there are so many problems with the resurrection accounts that I could fill up 2 hours of little nuggets of that contradiction, why this doesn't make sense. That is not a burial practice that would work. This load of rubbish, blah, 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 blah. The point is, you have a set of events with a very, very low prior probability, and you have a bunch of evidence that is not good enough to do the job of leaving someone with a justification for believing this. It is not the most probable account of the data of what happened. There are so many naturalistic theories. Almost anything is more probable. I mean, this is the interesting thing is that you can say almost anything is more probable than what you find in the Bible. it's extraordinary that people can believe that, but people believe Noah's Ark, right? And that's absolutely nuts. There's not enough water in the world. There's literally, it's just a bonkers story, but you're taught it when you're 6 years old, and you have a nice little song that goes along with it, and the animals go in the ark 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. And it's fine that God kills everyone on earth by 8 people and huge amounts of ecosystems. That's fine. Yeah, no worries. It's a really sweet story. So you end up believing absolutely nonsense things, and then overlaying all this complex justification and theology. Well, it's the same here, but this actually involves the God figure himself. Now, almost anything is more probable than a God-man spirit sacrificing himself to pay for sins that he knew would happen, that he designed into the system, and would have no coherent need of being balanced so that he could sit on his own right hand in heaven for perhaps eternity. That is what's going on here. I know that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, cynical, but pretty much that's what's going on. We have a Messiah figure who died. We have cognitive dissonance of his believers. That means cognitive dissonance is when you have you have a core belief in your mind, and you have a set of evidence that goes against that core belief. So effectively 2 beliefs. You know, Jesus is God, or Jesus was just an itinerant preacher who I thought was God, but actually isn't, right? Jesus died. His body's gone. Okay. Okay, Jesus is God, right? I keep this one core idea, and I can use mental heuristics and mechanisms to get rid of the evidence against my position or the other belief or whatever. So your core belief maintains. They would have been following Jesus as he was the Messiah, and that core belief will maintain. And this was started, this theory of cognitive dissonance, by Leon Festinger with a UFO cult. Really interesting story around that, well worth looking into. But cognitive dissonance is really, really prevalent here. They then retrospectively crawl through the Old Testament for hints and prophecies. Perhaps they see that there's an idea of a sacrificial lamb rather than a military figure that goes on and wins for Israel or Judea or whatever. We have a sacrificial lamb, so he's not a hero, he dies, but Yom Kippur, okay, this fits in with some kind of Jewish theology here and some stuff we found in the Old Testament. Okay. There are so many options. I mean, Bart Ehrman says, as one example, the tomb wasn't empty. A few disciples removed the body, so he does get put in the tomb. Then some disciples are going to move his body to take it maybe to their home, to wherever, to do whatever with, and they get caught by some guards, and they get killed by these soldiers. And now the soldiers have 3 bodies, and they don't know who the heck they are, Jesus and 2 random blokes. So they pick them up, take them down to Gehenna, and bury them in the shallow grave or burn them or whatever. Tomb is now empty. Disciples go there. The tomb is empty. Cognitive dissonance, hallucinations, whatever. Bart Ehrman says, is this likely? No, it's not likely. It's not likely. That is not a likely account of what happened. Is it more likely than the Christian account? Hell yeah. It is much more probable than breaking the laws of the universe as we know them, and being the only one to successfully do that whilst all other dying and rising gods are not believed. So you can come up with all numbers of theories. I mean, my one, again, it's just putting some pieces of the jigsaw together, but Jesus was left on the cross, had to be removed before Passover sundown. So it's a religious time. They didn't want people on the cross. It was a very holy time for the Jews. And he was hastily given a temporary tomb, and there is precedence for this in places. Jesus was then later moved from the tomb, lent by someone, maybe Joseph of Arimathea, someone like him, or he was maybe overlaid as a mythology on top of whoever it was, and then put in a shallow grave as per the protocol. So that was normal. Had to be taken down quickly. It's Passover. Let's get him in that tomb. Right. Okay. That now it's daytime again. Okay. Let's whack him in a shallow grave. But the disciples think he's actually in that tomb. So they didn't know that he was then moved to a shallow grave. And they came to the tomb where they thought he was buried, only to find it empty. Oh my goodness, it's empty. And then tales of angels were mythologized onto the account, or they even had hallucinations. Now, this sounds wildly improbable. It's not. 13% of people who have experienced death of someone close, either orally or visually, hallucinate. Hallucinations, even mass hallucinations, In the Bible, you have people having visions all the time. They are hugely, common throughout the world over time, right? This is naturalistically explained. Whether hallucinations were involved or not, I don't know, but it's far more probable than the Christian explanation. Or the authorities removed the body for one reason or another from the cross or tomb. The woman went to the wrong tomb. The disciples stole the body to contrive a resurrection. The tomb was never visited, and the whole set of events were completely mythologized. There's a swoon theory, so perhaps the idea that Jesus never actually died. He was taken down on the cross, and he was actually still alive. And there are so many naturalistic theories. You can go and research them all. No matter what the theory is, it is almost certainly more probable than the supernatural theory that we have, from both your prior probability, but also the level of the evidence that is brought to the table. It's not consonant with what we know about the time, about the practices. It's contradictory with the account. Each account is contradictory with the other accounts. They're sometimes internally contradictory. It's crazy. And so my conclusion is the resurrection didn't happen. It was some kind of naturalistic explanation that was then, mythologized over a period of time and embellished, which we can see the embellishment take place throughout the Gospels. And then we have a religion, helped along by Paul and a lot of his theology, and then the Gospels. We have a religion in Christianity. But did the nativity happen? No. Did the resurrection happen? No. They're the two parts, the bookends of the Gospels, where you can verify it with history, and they fail. All that stuff in the middle, all the miracles, who were they? How can we verify them? Though that you can't verify at all. But if you look at the two bits you can verify and think that they fail, what does it say about all that stuff in the middle? The whole thing falls down. The nativity falls down, the resurrection falls down. If you don't have these historical events, what can you hang the theology on? It's no use just saying, yeah, I don't need that because it's the meaning of these things that are important. You can't tell me the meaning of the resurrection is important enough for you to believe in Christianity or be a Christian, but not have a resurrection. So the meaning of the resurrection, the meaningfulness of the death and the resurrection is what drives your belief, but you understand that it didn't happen. You're playing silly buggers with mental gymnastics there. So if the resurrection fails, Christianity fails. Even Paul understood that. And there you go. That's where we're at. That's my conclusion. Thank you for listening, and sorry for rattling through this at a rate of knots. And I wonder if John is around.
I sure am. And thank you very much, Jono. If we were in the pub, like in days of yore, you would now get a huge round of applause. Maybe I should have some canned applause that I can dub in at this point. And then the rest of us would go off for a wee and get another pint. And we come back in a few minutes' time and ply you with questions. Well, we're going to cut the break and we're going to go straight to the questions. But before we do, I've got Michael Sherlock from Tasmania, but only on audio.
Okay.
So I'm going to introduce him now. Hello, Michael. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, John.
Excellent. Good man. Welcome. And how the devil are you?
I'm really good, thank you. And yeah, I caught most of that presentation, Jono. It's really good. I wrote about that, I guess, that area about in 2012. So I found it really interesting to kind of get a recap on those big issues. It was really good and really well presented as well. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, thanks, Michael. And really, I mean, each one of those points could be expanded, several times over. So it really was a whistle-stop tour, and I probably just skimmed over an awful lot that I shouldn't have. But there you go. Wets the apple.
I think the crux. I personally think the crux of the issue is when you're dealing with the resurrection, you're dealing with a miracle. Because Christianity is based on, it has to be based on historicity, otherwise there's no point to it. Although there were different schools of thought in early Christianity, there were the more, I guess, the school from Alexandria that believed it was all allegorical and so forth, or a large part was allegorical. But essentially, because it relies on history, you have to ask yourself, what is history as a discipline? History is an examination of the most probable occurrences in the past. Given that miracles are the most improbable occurrences, history has no access to them as a discipline. So Christianity is ahistorical to start with, or the miracles in Christianity. They cannot be supported by history. It's just not part of the discipline. You cannot examine that. You're only dealing in probabilities.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah,
Guys,
sorry, John.
I'm going to go into the control room now and let you guys carry on. And then I'm going to pop up some of the questions that we've been receiving from the audience. Sure. And maybe, Michael, how's your vision of the screen? Have you got a good picture?
Oh, I can see perfectly. It's just if I connect the camera, because of the internet issues I'm having, it slows down the audio, and yeah, I sound like an alien.
So would you be able to read out the questions in case we've got any people who are trying to see it on a tiny screen, or, you know, have poor sight like I do?
I'll try. I actually don't see questions. I see Jono's face. I see you.
Yeah, I haven't put them up.
Questions.
Wait a minute.
Oh, good.
They'll come. I'm going. So bye-bye from me.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, brilliant.
All right, see you later.
So what I wanted to say to that, Michael, was actually that that summed up. I think it's perhaps dangerous to say that miracles can't happen, because you're kind of shutting the door on the supernatural, which I think we've got good inductive reasons to do that, but you know, I think that's going to shut down a lot of Christian thinkers. But I think if you just continue with the maxim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, I think that gets you to the same place. So that you say, okay, so you're saying a miracle happened. So in the talk, I talked about a dragon and a unicorn dancing in my bath with a dog and a skunk in a scuba outfit. And I said, right, if that's my claim, then I need some crazy good evidence to support that, because that is breaking the laws of the universe as we know them, or you know, it's creating mythological creatures in my bath. So, okay, I'll grant you that miracles can happen as part of my background knowledge. But if I grant you that, you've got to have some pretty damn good evidence to overcome the low priors.
I agree with you, Jono. And my point with regards to probability is that the study of the discipline of history deals in probabilities only.
Yeah.
History's not a cut and dried science like chemistry. So we're dealing with probabilities only in history. The fact that miracles are improbable events puts them out of the purview of history. That you just cannot use history to back up the miracles of the Gospels and Christianity and the Old Testament as well. It's bullshit.
I think arguably you could maybe nowadays, if you had video attestation and certain, I don't know, technological things, you could contrive a way to be able to establish a miracle claim, perhaps. Also,
what about Photoshop, John?
Yeah, but exactly. But at least some kind of non-zero probability, or a higher probability than maybe 2,000 years ago. But yeah, it is a problem. Yeah,
I definitely take your point in that respect, and particularly, like you said, when we're dealing with ancient history, when we look at the style that was in vogue around the 1st century and around the time of the authors, you'll see that the style was more what would you call it? Fanciful. Than it is today.
Yeah, so the contemporaneous historians at the time were Suetonius and other such people. They were attempting to write sorts of histories, but they were embellishing them with really fanciful ideas. I mean, what was the one account of the army and you know, the sky was alight with fire. I don't know. They have the historians, or so-called historians at the time, were incredibly unreliable. So then to say, well, the Gospel, Luke is such a reliable writer, as Christians often say, it's like, well, how can you say that? Where is his historiography? What are his methodologies? Who are his sources? How are his accounts verifiable?
Yeah, and as you rightly pointed out as well, you're dealing with sources that are laced with bias. So essentially, these people have a vested interest to prove a point. When anyone has a vested interest to prove a point, when it comes to writing history, their bias is going to enter. a bias will enter regardless. But when anyone has that type of bias, that type of emotional bias, you cannot rely on that source solely. You do need extra evidence to back up the claim. It's not to say that they're definitely wrong because they have a bias. They could be right and have a bias.
Yeah.
But in this case, again, comes down to probability. It's improbable.
And it's about applying your metric. So it's about, that's why I use the David Koresh. I don't even have the David Koresh example.
Yeah, I saw that.
Say that if you apply this metric that you accept with the resurrection accounts to David Koresh, actually you know that it's nonsense, because you wouldn't accept it with the David Koresh example. So why are you accepting it with the Jesus example? And of course, it's because it's wrapped up with your upbringing, with all sorts of psychological things and maybe personal experience and God and whatnot. But there is a question on the screen, Michael. Did you want to read that one out and tackle that to begin with?
I'll try and see it. I can't see it. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can. I can read it to you. So the question is from William van Zwanenburg. I hope I pronounced that all right. In terms of historicity, what evidence does exist that Jesus existed? Oh, big one.
Do you want to start on that, or do you want me to?
You're welcome to. I can go for it.
Essentially, when you look at the consensus among biblical scholars, I think the first thing you need to understand is that they're Christian, and that's really important. The second thing is there is evidence for a historical Jesus. However, that evidence fails on a few fronts in terms of contemporaneity, again, bias. So there are issues. So I'm not a mythicist as such. I don't subscribe to the Jesus myth theory that Jesus never existed at all as a historical person. But at the same time, I don't think we have sufficient evidence to say, well, yeah, Jesus definitely existed. And again, dealing with ancient history, you can never say, yeah, this definitely happened. So I think, yeah, you go, Jono. I can see you want to say something.
No. I was just going to say my take on that. I didn't want to cut you off, mate. My take, I'm not a mythicist either, but I think what we know about Jesus from the Gospels and Paul is so far removed from the actual Jesus that it might as well be a myth. So the real Jesus would have been an itinerant preacher who had attracted a number of followers. He was executed and died. End of, right? And he probably did a bunch of things as an itinerant preacher that were semi-remarkable, or probably not that remarkable, can be explained obviously naturalistically. So what we know about him from the Bible is so unrepresentative of the original Jesus that would have existed. I think there probably was a real person, but he just would have been an itinerant preacher. That it might as well be a myth. So I think you just get to the same place.
Yeah, and an example of what you're talking about there, I think you can find that within the Gospels themselves. So each Gospel, essentially, well, there's 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, represent, and each between themselves as well, represent a different Jesus. They each have a different Jesus. And then compare those to the Jesus of John's Gospel, John being written much later. The Christology in John's Gospel bestows far more divinity on him. And so each one has a different Jesus, even within the 4 Gospels themselves. So I think that goes to your point really well.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, but mainly because you agree with me. So Dunking Atheism's question is, why do you atheists keep on presenting yourselves as neutral? Oh, interesting. I would say
neutral
I'm not,
in the sense of what?
Well, yeah, I would say I'm not neutral. I have my beliefs, and I will be bringing baggage to the floor. So I'm not neutral, but hopefully what I am saying has a ring of objectivity to it, because it's a bit like John Loftus in his book The Outsider Test for Faith, which is actually a really good book. It's an obvious premise, but it's a really well put together book, where it says that, look, you need to treat your own religion like you do every other religion. Step out of it and then attack it with the same kind of metrics that you attack other religions, and the same mechanisms, and then see if it's still standing. And hopefully I've done this through, I've written like 3,000 blog posts and a number of books, and hopefully I put my own views out there in order to be cut down if they can be. And so far they haven't, and I'm quite happy with where my conclusions are. I don't lay in bed at night thinking, oh, that part of my whole worldview doesn't work. So I'm not neutral. No one's neutral, but as long as we are aware of our own biases, that I think that's the best place to start.
I think you're exactly right in that respect. You're exactly right. And like we were talking before, everyone comes to the table with biases. We can't help it. We're all victims of heuristic thinking in some respect, and we all bring that to the table. But having said that, when it comes to looking at religions as a whole, I think atheists are the best position to be the most neutral in this respect. And that goes to Loftus's point. Treat your religion like you treat any others. Atheists treat religion all the same. It's all nonsense, essentially. I mean, there's good philosophies in there, there's good teachings, but essentially the claims that are being made that, trespass upon the natural world, we treat them all equally, whether they're from Hinduism, whether they're from Buddhism, whether they're from Christianity, Islam, any religion, we treat them all the same. So I think we're neutral in that regard. Would you agree, Jono, or not?
Well, I would say that what I've done here tonight with the resurrection, if you took that same approach, you could apply it to any religious claim or even historical claim.
Exactly.
And so therefore, in that sense, as I think you're saying there, it is neutral, as in this isn't an argument particular to atheism. This is an argument particular to, well, not particular to anything. It pertains to doing decent analysis of a claim, of a truth proposition. And I think it would work just as well with David Koresh as it would with Islam and any other religion. So and claims of atheism, but atheism doesn't have historical claims, right? So what we have is history. So we might say, I would apply the same claims to a claim of Suetonius, right? Who made a claim who you might call it atheistic, or do you know what I mean? Something that's non-religious, that's a historical claim, then I'd apply it to that. And I think it's if you're using the same tools to address the different worldviews, then I think that you're being as neutral as you can be.
I agree with you. And I think the biggest point to that is when a Christian looks at Christian history, generally speaking, of course, there's a lot of exceptions to rules, but they're victims of obviously confirmation bias. And one of the reasons is, and I wrote about this in my first book, is that the ego has mechanisms of defense to keep its integrity intact, essentially. So whenever you're essentially applying rules, if you're within the group that you're trying to criticize, there are going to be certain, what would you call it? Yeah, the best word is defense mechanisms that are going to prevent you or make it harder for you to see the facts objectively, to see the situation, to analyze in an objective fashion. And again, none of us are fully objective, but that's that neutrality issue that comes in, where atheists, I think, are far more neutral when it comes to analyzing all religious claims the same way than a Christian is analyzing Christian claims, than a Muslim is analyzing Islamic claims, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a famous claim. I mean, William Lane Craig used to use this, and a few Gary Habermas and stuff, that 75% of scholars, biblical scholars, believe in the anti-tomb. It's like, well, 99.9% of Islamic scholars believe in the claims of Muhammad. Does that make it true? No, it means that they're all Muslims wanting to go into Islamic scholastics in order to defend their own worldview. So the claims, that their conclusion they come up with, have no more truth by the fact that 99.9% of the people in that field believe them. And the same with biblical scholars. So when you adjust for atheistic biblical scholars, actually it looks pretty much 50-50. So yeah, I don't know if that's particularly where you were going, but it's a useful thing to add on.
No, it's exactly what I was. Yeah, it does go to the point.
So next question, and God, this has taken me about 10 years when I was looking into this, and I don't know if I can remember all the research I was doing. But the question is, from a Facebook user: if the Gospels were written after the fall of the temple, so 72 CE, how come there's no mention of it, given it would have been a huge event at the time?
Yeah, again, that's that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence argument. However, having said that, yeah, it does stink a little bit.
Yeah, and the question is whether there will be hints about it, because at the end of the day, what you've got to remember is if that happened in 72 CE and they are writing about events that happened 40 years before, why would the temple feature? And as far as I remember it, there are elements of the story. Is in particularly Mark. I think this is the argument that Mark was written after the fall of the temple, because actually you can see elements of the fall of the temple in his narrative. But again, it's like 10 years since I've looked into that and argued about it. But again, you wouldn't necessarily see it because they are writing about 40 years previously to that. But you can, I think, see elements of the fall within certain aspects of the stories. But you know, don't quote me on it.
Yeah, it's been about the same time that long ago. I was actually looking into that stuff as well, and I wrote it down because I have a terrible memory, so that's why I'm an author. I write things down. But yeah, I go through all of that detail in my first book as well, particularly with Matthew, where you have these retrospective prophecy fulfillments. Essentially, I think the fall. Yeah, I think you might be right. It might be Mark, where the fall of the temple is kind of, I guess, mentioned as part of a prophecy. Which a lot of scholars then say, well, you know, Mark was aware of the fall of the temple, and so therefore it was probably written later, although a lot of scholars will put Mark around, I think, 50 CE.
Yeah,
but yeah, again, don't quote me on that.
Yes, yeah. So again, that's something I'm going to have to re-look into again. So another question, Comrade Diodato. If you had to pick one, what, in your view, might be considered the theist's most convincing argument for the physical resurrection? Well, I suppose that the fact that people did, I mean, right, none of the actual claims really are anything special in the gospel. So I can just, none of it I see it as strong. The only strength you can think of is something like the conviction with which Paul believes in the resurrection as a general idea. He doesn't go into any details, right? So, or you could say the followers of Jesus. Now, we know that people all over the world have massive conviction for all sorts of false beliefs, right? So but the fact that people did believe strongly in the resurrection is, I suppose, a piece of evidence that has some traction, but really not a lot else.
I agree to an extent, but then you have to look at, I guess, that motif of the death, the resurrection, was quite common in ancient poetry and ancient narratives as well. And in that general region as well, you'll find examples of it, where I guess God men have died and come back. Or at least that you've got, for example, another good analogy of that is the phoenix, right? So the mythology of the phoenix, which predates Jesus, was going around, and that has that same, I guess it's what do you call it? Animism? Is it animism as well? So basically based on the natural cycles of, spring and winter and summer and all that. Also with regards to that ancient kind of stellar mythology that was quite popular at the time. So, and Clement of Rome actually wrote that if you look at Jesus, it's really analogous to this earlier phoenix myth that these guys were talking about. So even some of the early Christian scholars were finding, I guess, parallels to that mythology that was, I guess, put onto a potentially historical Jesus, or the legendary aspects of Jesus that were drawn from very, close regions and regions that did have a cultural impact. And I think, was it Dennis MacDonald that went into, I guess, analyzing what cultural influences, whether they were direct or whether they were, I guess, I can't think of the words now, quite a long time ago. But essentially that type of death and resurrection story was, quite common in that time. But I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Jono.
Well, there's a lot of mimetics and a lot of sort of copying of ideas. Dennis MacDonald certainly talks about that. But I think, and you look at the nativity and contemporary sort of mythology, there are ideas that you can see of other religions being brought into play, certainly in the nativity accounts, and resurrection as an idea is definitely not exclusive to Christianity at all. So you would expect to find. I mean, the thing for me is the whole atonement. I mean, the resurrection is one thing, but what does it mean? Why did it happen? And why it happened is the atonement, right? And if you can't make sense of the atonement, which I can't, right? I can't even make sense of the Holy Trinity, right? Of Jesus, God the Father, and Holy Spirit all in one. So I can't make sense of that. I can't make sense of atonement. So it's almost like the resurrection is a moot point, because the reason it happened were for these other things, and these other things don't make any sense either.
No, that doesn't make historical sense. It doesn't make theological sense. And I don't think any of the authors of the Gospels fully understood the Trinity either, to be honest.
Well, no, I mean, it seemed like a later sort of rationalization, didn't it? So there was a question that is disappeared now, but it was something to do with the prior probability of God. It's gone. It was a good question, but I can't remember it. So we'll go for this one. Don't many Christian stories come from Egyptian stories?
You got to be careful in this area, because
I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah. Okay. I was very good friends with Acharya S, or DM Murdoch.
Right.
And she was a dead set mythicist. We started a human rights organization together, and she's very passionate in that respect. But her and I would have massive arguments about this kind of area, because I think people are trying to, like, they bring up the Horus and Osiris myths and things like that to try and compare. And there are analogies. And you have to understand that when you're using analogies in that respect, in the mythological sense, this is what Christian apologists do the best. They say, well, look at these differences, so they're not the same. You have to understand these are symbolic. So if you can find symbolic patterns, essentially then you can say, well, yeah. And then if you can find influence, cultural influence, and that have crept into the area, then I think you can say, well, okay, well, there's a likelihood, or there's a potential that these stories influenced this particular story from the gospel. But in terms of, I guess, I'm a little bit wary when it comes to that. And again, it's been over 10 years since I've looked at these comparative mythological aspects. But yeah.
I absolutely agree with you. And I remember early on in my sort of journey into this kind of stuff, reading a lot of sort of Robert Price, and thinking, yeah, that sounds really good, yeah, and then just thinking, whoa, this can't all be, it's almost like, and here's another example, and it's like, whoa, okay, I get the idea that there can be some sort of cultural borrowing or historical borrowing or contemporary mythology going on here, but the extent to which that goes is arguable, and I sort of say this in my nativity book, where you can definitely see relationships to other nativity accounts in other religions and other mythologies, but it doesn't mean to say that that's definitely something that was intended to be. I mean, it's right, and I think it's dangerous to go down the route of thinking, it seems to me that the mythologists often, they take one, they take them all. And I think that can be dangerous.
I agree with you 100%. Now, one of the, I think, arguments I'd put forth for explaining some of the differences between, I guess, some of the earlier myths that may be comparative to some of the ones that exist in the Gospels is when apologists point out the distinctions, and sometimes petty, sometimes big, when they point out the distinctions, I would point out the distinctions between Bollywood movies that are based on Hollywood movies. Because when you've got cultural influences that were, like, look at Judaism, it was a backwater, essentially. Yes, it was on the main trading route, but as a region, it was a fairly backwater place, insignificant, compared to, say, the big Hellenistic empires that essentially ruled over it for quite some time, centuries. Compared to ancient Egypt that essentially ruled over it as well, Phoenicia to the north, and then you have the Persian Empire as well having a great influence, Assyria, Babylon. These big empires surrounding this little place were obviously going to have some type of cultural impact on the region. And that impact would, again, be analogous to the impact that today Hollywood has had on Bollywood in terms of I guess, movies and narratives and stories. Would you take that argument, John?
Yeah, that sounds perfectly analogous. So yeah, absolutely. Next question, and this is one I referred to just a minute ago. If Jesus was the Son of God, then it's a total one-off. So is prior probability relevance?
Oh, that's a good argument. Yeah, I like that one. I remember I've dealt with that one before. I just can't remember what my answer was. Is probability? Probability is relevant because we're basing it on sources that claim to be historical. And again, we go back to the situation where, history doesn't have access to the improbable. So I'd say it remains improbable, but you go from your perspective, John.
Well, I'd say that the prior probability is still low, right? And it doesn't mean to say it didn't happen, right? So I could say that my mum turned into a unicorn yesterday. It's the only time it's happened. It's the only time it will happen. It's got a probability of 1 if my claim is true.
That's not true. My mum did the same yesterday as well, John.
God damn. So what happens here is the person I'm making this claim to has the right to say, okay, well, the prior probability is really low, but you're still making a claim that you're trying to convince me to believe. So why should I believe that claim that you've made? Even if the prior probability is low, you're claiming it's still true. So you need to still give me evidence to justify that. So I think you still need the evidence to overcome those low priors. You still need to be justified in the evidence. Otherwise, what are you going on? If you're not, it's this fideism. So if you're not going on evidence, then what? You're just believing what some bloke said or some woman said in some context. No, I'm not going to believe that. I need to believe things on evidence. So this is an evidence-based system, belief that I'm holding or should be holding. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Again, yeah. And an analogy to that. Let's go to Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhists, when they first come up in the council that split Buddhism from Hinayana to Mahayana Buddhism, claimed that there were these serpent people called Nagas who were hiding the secret teachings of Buddha in a parallel dimension for hundreds of years after Buddha's death. And that was their justification for their theological significance in terms of Buddhism. So that's what they brought to the table. That's the same situation. Why can't we believe that? It's a one-off situation. So what should we believe that equally as believing that Jesus was resurrected or the Son of God? It's the same scenario. And an atheist will look at both scenarios with the same, I guess, contempt, to be honest.
You still need evidence. You still need evidence.
You do.
So Terence Waits asks, Christian apologists state that they have rebutted the probability arguments. Well, they claim they've rebutted every argument from an atheist.
They have, yeah.
Are you aware of what reasons they are using for that rebuttal? I invited one tonight, but he didn't turn up. So the probability, the idea is that actually the probability is high. So what are the arguments Christians use or they might not say the probability is high. They might say that actually using the probability argument is false. So there's two aspects possibly that a Christian could take. I mean, without more detail on the exact claims, it's obviously asking us for what we know about what Christians argue. What would you say?
I'm going to sound like a broken record. Okay, so we're basing this on historical texts, yes or no? An oral tradition that became a textual tradition later. Yes. And the textual tradition, again, flawed for years and years and years, as Ehrman's pointed out in his works. But again, we're basing it on history, yes or no?
We're basing it on what people claim are historical texts and our history, and that I think that's the difference. I wouldn't see it necessarily. Firstly, I wouldn't see Gospels as history; they're not historical texts. No, they are making claims of events that happened supposedly in history. So,
but it trespasses on the discipline of history, doesn't it?
Of course, yes.
So if it trespasses on the discipline of history, then what is the study of history? But whatever the most probable events that occurred in the past. These events are not probable. They're improbable. By their nature, miracles are improbable events. So history doesn't have access to it, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think what Christians generally tend to do is to assert in some way, or try and show in some way, that the Gospels are reliable sources, and we disagree on that. And that the claims aren't contradictory, and you can have some kind of mental gerrymandering and gymnastics that will allow those contradictions to harmonize, and that in fact there is somehow precedence for the things that are claimed of the resurrection in terms of burial rituals and whatnot. But I just don't think that they are good enough. I don't think those arguments hold up. There is no way I can see that the Christians have rebutted the probability arguments, because it comes down to them thinking the Gospels are reliable when they're not on any metric I know, and that there aren't contradictions, and there seems to be a fairly reasonable evaluation of the claims.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. Yep.
So there you go. In spite of so this is from a Facebook user. In spite of lack of evidence, do you think believers believe because they cannot accept a finite life, a life with no meaning? Oh, great question. Do you want to start off on this one? In spite of a lack of evidence,
you look really excited to take this one, so I'm going to let you go.
So belief for me is psychological, right? I helped edit a book by James Lindsay called "Everybody's Wrong About God," and the idea that in a post-God universe, in a post-God world where we're kind of ditching God, what do you replace God with? Because God provides a psychological function, okay? Whether it be in underwriting morality for you, whether it be as a social network in your Bible Belt America or whatever, or in your church network, whether it be mortality, terror management theory and mortality salience. So the idea that I'm going to die, oh my goodness, it's a comfort blanket because I'm going to live forever. That infinite life, I think, is huge. I mean, atheism struggles to be able to provide anything as powerful as that, right? You die, shit happens, you become worm food. End of. There you go. Meaning has to be subjectively and independently derived because we don't believe in an ultimate meaning giver. I actually think that's more noble. I think it's more noble to think up your own purpose and meaning in life without having one imposed on you by a third party. But I think belief is largely psychological, and the problem is you can't. What's the old maxim? You can't reason someone out of a position they haven't reasoned themselves into. So if belief is hugely psychological, then in order to get someone to disbelieve, then it's a game of psychology often.
I agree. I wouldn't say it's largely belief is largely psychological. I'd say it's purely psychological.
Yeah. Okay.
Honestly, it's and it's when you look at this type of belief as well. I want my consciousness to live forever. It's the perfection of egotism, isn't it? It's the ego wanting to exist forever. I wasn't important before I was born, and I'm not going to be important after I die. I see pre-birth as afterlife. It's irrelevant. I will be irrelevant, and I'm completely comfortable with that. I love my sleep anyway. So, look, I personally think that belief in the afterlife and that eternal life, I think it's psychological gluttony, to be honest.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of wishful thinking. I keep having an argument with a very close friend of mine who maintains a belief in a sort of universalist God. And he's arrived at that, and I think that's a really interesting. And if I was a Christian believer, that would be the kind of God I believe in, because a judgmental God makes no sense to understand the world and divine foreknowledge and all sorts. So if I believed in God, it would be a universalist God where everyone is saved somehow, and that's generally a lot nicer. But there's an awful lot of wishful thinking involved. In my opinion, there's an awful lot of like, well, it would be nicer if this is the case, so I'm going to believe this to be the case. It's like, yeah, but what's the actual evidence for that? Like, what's your epistemic warrant that sits outside of just purely wishful thinking? And I think you know, a lot of people probably fall into that category of believing things because it's psychologically convenient for them to do so.
A friend of mine has coined the word wishful thinkianity, which I rather like. And when we're on the subject of the the oral tradition or hearsay, I like to tell the story about the one-armed fisherman. You know, he caught a fish and it was that big. You couldn't say it was that big. He only had one arm. So that's what makes me question word of mouth with a gap of a generation between the claimed events and the actual writing down.
God,
anyway,
I can't remember
one of the
last week.
John, if I can interrupt, one of the counter arguments to that is at the time around the 1st century, there was an oral tradition, and the way it was transposed or the way it was passed on was done in a very systematic fashion that kept it reliable. This is one of the arguments, and there is some good evidence to go to the development of a very solid oral tradition back then. Again, when you're dealing with history and you're dealing with oral tradition, you're always going to be less reliable than texts to a certain degree. But there are arguments that say, well, the early oral traditions in the 1st century were done in such a method that kept them very reliable. And I think there are some arguments to that fact. But again, I
think that takes that probably demands a few caveats. So reliable from what the original source oral tradition was to the later oral tradition. In other words, there isn't too much deviation, but it doesn't say anything about whether the original claim was true or not, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So basically, let's say there was a story made up in let's say the year 10. That story would stay the same up until 90 CE. That has nothing to do whether or not the original story was actually true or not. And having said that, then I need to, I guess, counterpose that with, well, there's evidence that the oral traditions did actually change quite significantly the stories, and that again is found between all the Gospels and the discrepancies themselves.
Yeah.
Well, I'm here representing skeptics, so I'm afraid I'm going to take stories with a pinch of salt. Probably Lot's wife's worth of salt. Anyway, guys, you've been fantastic, and I've let you run on because normally I try to keep these shows to about 1 hour, but we are beginning to lose some of our audience now. Yeah. So I'm thinking, let's have that big round of canned applause. And thank you very much for taking part. Thank you very much for watching, whoever's on the other end at the moment now. And these guys' books will be in the comments underneath, so you can follow them up. And don't forget, on whichever platform you're viewing on, to like and subscribe so that you get to hear about our future events. And next week, we've got a show on... which is it? I think it's next week. I think is paleontology, and the week after that is history, or is it the other way around? Check on our Facebook Skeptics in the Hub group, guys. That was fantastic. John, you want to say something?
I just want to say one more thing, right? Which is just a random bit of fun. So the human body has something like 100 trillion cells, and only 1 in 10 of those cells are human cells. In other words, most of our body is made up of foreign microorganisms that are alive, bacteria and viruses and other microbial organisms. So when Jesus was resurrected, actually we saw a resurrection of absolutely millions of entities. Millions.
Crawling with life. Well, on that thought, I'm going to play the outro music. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, Michael. Cheers, John.
There